In this episode we're going to bring you another chopping board video. I'm going to use up some of the walnut and maple that I've got lying around to try and make a nice new chopping board. We'll go unpack that and have a little go. Let's do it. The first thing I need to do is crack open this fresh delivery of walnut. I bought quite a bit and I'm not going to use all of it for this project, just the one length should do the trick. You can see the wood has some swooshes through it, and that's the leftover marks from the mill I bought it from, and I bought it like this on purpose. You can buy the lumber planed or just cut to width. I found planed lumber was about 30% more expensive than cut to width, so I decided to stick with cut to width and planed it down myself. I want to mill this lumber down, but I'm not doing the whole length in one hit. First, I'm going to cut it down to rough size using a miter saw, using most of a single length to do so before passing it through the thicknesser. Each pass I make through the thicknesser is only taking a small amount off the top, so I need to make multiple passes to work through all the saw marks. With one flat-ish side, I flipped the piece over and did the same on the other side to get it flat-ish too. I quickly put this jig together to help me square the piece. I ran one edge through the table saw to make sure that it was a perfect square to the bottom of the piece. I ended up doing this to both pieces before removing the jig and relying only on the fence to put the square cut on the other side of the piece. This leaves each piece not quite perfectly square, but close enough for a chopping board. And putting the pieces together gives me a fairly clean joint. It's not perfect, but it's pretty close. I spent a little time moving the pieces around, checking both sides, trying to find a good match on the joint before marking them and moving on. And that's the walnut sorted for the time being, so let's take a look at the maple. These maple boards are thicker than the walnut, so I need to bring them down a little. I could use the thicknesser for this and make a lot of passes, but I decided to cut the worst of it off on the table saw. I knew I'd need to run the aftermath through the thicknesser anyway, so I set the fence up to be the same width as the piece of walnut, and then a smidge over to give me something to thickness off. Normally I'd have done this cut with a bandsaw, but I don't have one, so I'm using the table saw instead. I'm making two cuts halfway through the piece to cut off the excess. And finally, another trip through the thicknesser to get rid of the burns. I think it's time for me to change the blade on my table saw. With the lumber now ready, it's time to cut some slices out to make an interesting pattern. First I decided to cut off a 30mm strip of the walnut, then 2 more strips of 5mm each. Then I cut a 20mm slice of maple and 2 5mm slices to finish it all off. It was very finicky to get the measurements correct here, so if anyone has any tips on doing this part more correctly, then please let me know down in the comments below. Time for a dry fit. Once I fit them together, I could see that one of the sides of the 20mm maple piece still had some milling marks on it. Whoops. Into the thicknesser you go. But overall, this piece is really coming together. After the dry fit, it's time to glue up. I'm making sure that I put plenty of glue in here, as I don't want any gaps to appear after the glue is dried. Once I applied pressure with the clamps, I wiped off the excess glue with some rags and water. Moment of truth. Has it glued nicely? In general, yes, but it's a bit uneven. I didn't do a good job at stopping the slices from drifting away, but that can be fixed with the thicknesser. However, no. The water I used to clean up the glue got near the clamps and left this dirty black gunk on the piece. Wiping it did nothing, but fortunately it hadn't soaked very deep as I'd only let it dry for an hour or so. Straight into the thicknesser with this one. After a few passes in the thicknesser, the piece is saved. Whew. Now it's time to trim the edges off and get this thing looking like a chopping board. I used the miter fence backwards on the table saw because I couldn't fit the piece on the normal way. Let me know in the comments how you deal with pieces that are far too deep for the miter fence. Now for the moment that I've been dreading, cutting the chamfers. I did this last time with a router and it was okay, but didn't come out deep enough for my liking. I set the table saw to 45 degrees and guesstimated the cut to halfway up the board. I did this on one side and then flipped it around to do it on the other. Now this next cut is the hard one. I had to sneak up on the previous cut so that the chamfer started exactly the same point, and I managed to get it after a test cut or two. Then it's a case of pushing it through and doing the other side. It's sanding time! I won't bore you with it too much. I did 2 sanding passes, one with a random orbital sander at 120 grit, and then once with a pad sander at 180 grit, because I didn't have higher grit discs, to get it pretty smooth. On each pass I drew some pencil scribbles on the board and sanded until they were gone, so I knew that I'd done enough. I tried to do the edges with sandpaper on a block, but I lost patience and just used the orbital sander again. The edges of the finished product aren't perfect, so I'm chalking this up as a mistake and moving on. I decided to add a small chamfer on the edge with the block plane. I knew I had to be careful not to blow out the edge grain while doing this, but I got myself a bit confused about where to start and end the cuts. I'm safe to chamfer along the grain, but if I'm chamfering the edge, I need to be careful to start on the edge and finish in the middle to make sure that the corners don't blow out. I did this backwards in the video, middle to edge, so don't do what I did. I used a cloth and some water to get the grain to pop on the board. After adding some water, you could already feel the extra grain coming up, so once the whole thing is dry, I hit it again with another pass of the 180 grit to get it really smoothed out. And finally, my favourite bit, the finishing. I'm using food grade mineral oil to finish this board, applying quite liberally with some kitchen towels. Once the coat is on, leave it to soak for a few minutes before wiping away little bits of excess and leaving it to dry for a few hours. The wood's going to be fairly thirsty, so you may need to come back and add another layer every day. And this is the final product. Internet, beat chopping board. And that's it for the project itself. Before I end the video, I just want to highlight some of the mistakes I made while making this board. I should have chosen my wood a bit better. I'm not pleased with this little dark patch considering the rest of the board looks nice and clean. And there's a few other little spots on the side. You can see there. Some of the maple. Just don't really know what's happening there, but there's a little something in the maple that doesn't really agree with the board. And the second thing, when I was doing some of the planing along the edges to get the chamfers, let's see if I can measure that up for you. There's some tear out on the edge there that doesn't look too good, but if you look at it from far enough away, it looks just fine. So. But overall, I'm really happy with how this turned out. I mean, the design is lovely. I think the whole thing is just fantastic. If you know what my last chopping board looked like, it's pretty plain. If you like this video, please like and consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps me out a lot. If you want to follow me on my socials, they're all down in the description too. Let me know if you decided to make a chopping board and share some pictures with me if you do. Take it easy, and I'll see you next time. Do you have anything to comment on? Try again. Subscribe if you think this would be easier, wouldn't you?